Today we have Dr. Mesrob Vartavarian, who is currently a visiting fellow at Cornell University's Southeast Asia program. He received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, and he began his career as a scholar of early colonial South Asia. However, he later shifted his research focus to modern Southeast Asia with an emphasis on the Philippines. His interests now include colonial state formation, plunder politics, borderland insurgencies by ethnic minorities, post-colonial Praetorian regimes, and Cold War era conflicts across insular and mainland states. Dr. Vartavarian is currently working on a monograph length on comparative sociology of military politics in post-colonial Southeast Asia. So thank you, Dr. Vartavarian, for joining us.
Thank you, Prach. Happy to be here.
All right. So the topic of the conversation today is going to be about the political economy of American power in the Asia Pacific. So we'll try to cover both the history of American power in the region and also some more contemporary developments, such as the rise of China and geopolitical policies during the Trump presidency. We'll also try to look into the near future, geopolitics under a Biden presidency as well. So let's start with the history. So can you take us through a short history of American power in the Asia Pacific?
Sure. So basically, when we're dealing with American power in the Pacific, it is a product of American expansion, which really began from the United States inception as a nation. Now, there, I think, has been too much emphasis in the literature among Americanists and scholars of American empire more generally, trying to connect continental and Pacific rim expansion. In other words, drawing a direct parallel between the American West and projection of American power into the Pacific. While that geography certainly works and is certainly linked from the American West into the Pacific and into the Southeast Asia later on, after the Second World War, there are fundamental differences between continental American power and oceanic American power. One being premised more on white settlement and demographic change, and the other being more premised on security, trade, and geostrategic interests that were always oriented towards the assertion of a very militarized form of dominance in the Asia Pacific by the United States. So that's the general demarcation I would make. Once we leapt past Southern California, or California, more the coast of California, the power dynamic became very different. It became much more militaristic, and it became much more linked with high technological development, in other words, military industries and the impact that has on American investment priorities and things like that.
Mm. Right. So a lot of people think that the Cold War was kind of a special period, and that was significant changes in American policies, American involvement in the region. Can you explain a little bit how did the Cold War change the nature of American power in the region?
Absolutely. I mean, to understand the nature of American power in the Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia more generally, we have to understand the manner in which the Pacific War emerged and was fought against the Japanese, and the sense of hegemony that created among American political and economic elites. In other words, the conflict with Japan over the Asia Pacific, largely over Southeast Asian resources within that Asia Pacific, was a very bloody struggle, which the United States basically won on its own. You had contributions from Australia, the Soviet Union, and Britain, but the United States felt, rightly so perhaps, that it was the power which vanquished the Japanese challenge to Western hegemony in the Asia Pacific. And it felt entitled to impose a degree of unipolarity, if you like, within the region. In other words, we fought, we conquered, we beat back the rival, the Japanese rival, and therefore we can impose political arrangements that are benefiting primarily beneficial to the United States. Now, how did they do that? It comes about in a very interesting way. Because the initial regional partner of the United States was intended to be China. But by 1948, it was very clear that China was to fall to a communist revolution which in the minds of the United States was very tightly linked to Moscow, to the Soviet Union. This sort of Manichaean bipolar world had very much emerged in the minds of American planners in 1948, or by 1948, in the Asia-Pacific certainly. So they shifted their regional partner from China to Japan. It's called the reverse course in the literature. And in order for the regional partner of the United States to be powerful, to be wealthy, it needed the resources of Southeast Asia: tin, rubber, oil, things like that, which Japan does not possess, and certainly went to war for, to acquire in a kind of enclosed economic bloc, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. What the United States does is it basically reconstitutes the Japanese sphere of influence under US security control. In other words, we'll arrange things so that you can extract resources from Southeast Asia, build up your economy, reindustrialize, and this applies right across the board from really Burma all the way to Indonesia in terms of the resources the Japanese needed to reconstruct and reconfigure their economy. But it has to be under US control. That really was the primary objective of the Cold War, of the United States and its Cold War mission in the Asia Pacific. Any attempts at independent nationalism or decolonization of a radical variety, unlike, say, in the Philippines, where you had a very conservative form of decolonization, which was perfectly okay. Any radical form of decolonization that would either pull a Southeast Asian or Asia Pacific nation away from the United States toward the communist bloc, or try and make a country neutral, in other words, playing both sides off against the other, the East Bloc and the West Bloc, say Sukarno's Indonesia being the best example of this, I think, that could not stand. And as much as we hear about communism and the containment of the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, yes, there was an ideological element to all of these policies, certainly. But at base, Cold War activities by the United States were based on very hard geostrategic realities. We project power in Asia through Japan, also certainly through South Korea, and these powers need the resources of Southeast Asia. However, they can only obtain these resources under our dominant oversight. That, at base, was the Cold War in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific more generally. Rhetoric playing, I think, a secondary role to most of that.
Yeah, from your answer, it sounds like the United States' primary goal was to reconstruct Japan and maintain Japan as like the main ally, right? And in doing that, the United States tried to, shall we say, exploit the resources of Southeast Asia.
Well, yes, certainly you have American corporations in these places, and they do make a lot of profit. Oil companies, liquefied natural gas companies, particularly in Indonesia. I think this is the main point of access for this. But I think if you're looking at the course of the Cold War decades, certainly by the 1970s, the Japanese have established a fairly large-scale hegemony in these economic exploitative venues. The Americans have a kind of, as much as we talk about infrastructure and Chinese investment, Belt and Roads initiatives today, if you go back to the 1960s, America's primary contribution, I think, to anti-communist Southeast Asian nations was of an infrastructural nature. Now, in a place like Thailand, that has some very enduring effects. The integration of the entire countries through roads, highways, air bases, airports, Sahatip port by Bangkok, that was modernized largely by the United States in the 1960s, playing a very big role in Thai economic takeoff. In other places, of course, the infrastructural input is more of an enclave effect. So the Philippines, for example, you have Clark and Subic, which are almost kind of self-contained entities that do not so much expand outward and encompass the entire archipelago. Basically, geography plays a role here because it's very difficult to integrate an archipelago in terms of infrastructure. Indonesia is having these problems today. So there is exploitation, yes, but increasingly it's Japanese corporations that are profiting from this. South Koreans also come in by the 1980s. Americans are more geostrategic in their thinking, and increasingly so as the Cold War decades wear on. It's much more about security, infrastructure, and investment than it is about natural resource extraction. The Japanese and the South Koreans are the ones that are certainly by the 1980s doing the large majority of that. With some, again, with some Australian corporate investment as well. So, but I think Japan has a hegemonic position in this regard.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so if the relationship between the US and American, Southeast Asian allies was primarily kind of exploitative with the goal to equipping Japan, then I was going to ask, how did these Southeast Asian allies benefit from their relationships with the US? Yes. I think I got some kind of answer from your comment earlier, but maybe you can expand a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, some benefit more than others. Those countries in Southeast Asia that have relatively stable and slightly more broad-based political elites actually do quite well. Singapore being the best example under the People's Action Party benefited enormously, I think, from the United States and the military alliance with the United States, joint exercises and things of this nature, because it could focus largely on consumer industry that it would export outward. It knew that its defense requirements basically would be taken care of by the United States. And also in exchange for these defense interactions with Singapore, the United States largely opens up its markets to Singapore products. And this benefits Singapore tremendously. Thailand is an interesting case because you do have a broad military bureaucratic elite, which is famously corrupt, of course, but I think they do rather better because they need to, it's the military as a whole, I think, that is benefiting from this American investment, not just one tiny faction or clique within the military, or if there is a tiny faction or clique, say the Sarit faction in the 1960s, and then Tanom and Prapas, this faction can, I think, dominate the military as a whole, and it distributes the goods that the US is providing, I think, fairly widely, even to the extent of allowing Thai entrepreneurs, Sino-Thai entrepreneurs, to benefit from this US roads, using the American highways and roads and airports to build property, to increase internal markets, things of this nature. When you get to very narrow regimes, like Suharto's Indonesia or Marcos in the Philippines, Suharto's Indonesia is an interesting case because it begins as a very broad-based military dictatorship, but it increasingly narrows as time goes on. Certainly by the 1980s, Suharto is only interested in enriching himself and his family and his cronies. That's when American investment becomes diverted and skewed, and I think benefits the general picture less and less. When you get to the Marcos regime, it was always a very narrow-based, oligarchic, almost kleptocratic regime right from the start, and it continues to be so increasingly. And American aid is funneled in to enriching Marcos and his family, hence, I think, doing the least good. So one has to be very careful about what country, what they are referring to. Of course, in the case of Vietnam, it's a completely exceptional case because we sink resources en masse into this very tiny area of Southeast Asia, and eventually we cannot create a regime that has an autonomous internal stability. The Thai military, all of its corruption and all of its criminality perhaps, was far more stable. It did not require propping up to that extent by the United States, possibly because it never experienced the pressures that you saw in South Vietnam. It was never attacked massively by the North Vietnamese, a very well-organized and cohesive military, constantly battering up against it. So they had the advantage of some distance to not have massive external destabilization. Yes, but I think the Thai military has a history, an esprit de corps that goes beyond the American experience, and therefore it could organize American resources more effectively and more efficiently. So one has to be very particular about what one is talking about. Some countries benefit, some really don't. The opposite extremes, if you like, would be Singapore benefiting tremendously, the Philippines benefiting almost not at all, I would say, from American aid.
Right. So that's the kind of the modern history of American involvement in the Asia Pacific. Let's turn now to some more contemporary issues. First of all, China is a huge factor. It has been rising. So my question is, what effect does the rise of China have on the balance of power in the Asia Pacific, and what has been the American response?
Absolutely. Well, it's often forgotten today, sadly, I think, that if you are looking at the initial rise of China, which began in 1979 with the Deng Xiaoping's reforms, so from 1979 to 1989, China actually plays a very beneficial role while it is initially beginning its economic reforms. It benefits the United States enormously. It destabilizes the unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam through Thai territory, supporting of the Khmer Rouge and so forth. China is doing this largely under American encouragement and with Washington's diplomatic blessing. Right? It also is a rival to the Soviet Union at this time. So one can very much say that China in the 1980s, from 79 to 89, roughly from the rise of the consolidation of Deng's power in 79 to the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, it benefits the United States. There is mutual benefit. What begins to happen in the 1990s is that China starts to become more autonomous in its engagement with the Asia Pacific. It has a rapprochement with the Soviet Union also in 1989, and then has increasing economic interactions with post-Soviet Russia. It begins its infrastructural investments gradually at first, but within the last 10 years, massively so, as a result of its Belt and Road Initiative, because it, like Japan, but on a much vaster scale, like Japan in the 1950s, it needs Southeast Asian resources to grow, to integrate, to have a balanced form of development. In other words, this idea that you need, China is very developed on its eastern coast, much less developed in its western interior and hinterland. The notion is we need Southeast Asia. We need the resources of a place like Myanmar, Burma, to pull up China's western interior and have a balanced form of development on both extremes of the Chinese landmass, if you like. And of course, the South China Sea being the most controversial aspect of this, I think, because it is beginning to demarcate and try to make the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. And naturally, this makes the United States quite nervous. Hence, the United States has increased joint military exercises with Southeast Asian nations. It has increased interoperability or continued policies to encourage the interoperability of the US military with other Southeast Asian militaries. Singapore, again, very, very important in this respect. Thailand with the Cobra Gold exercises, which began in the 1980s, but have continued really until the present day. And the Philippines with some attempts to reverse the joint exercises between the US and the Philippine military by Rodrigo Duterte in recent years. But I must say not successfully. This relationship between the US and the Philippine militaries is so heavily institutionalized that it has yet not succeeded. And of course, I think more controversially, attempting to encourage the rearmament of Japan, which raises all kinds of very complicated questions as to will Southeast Asia be willing to deal with a Japan that is fully rearmed and re-engaged in the security and military policies of fully autonomous nations. That raises all kinds of very interesting questions. Naturally, the Japanese are doing this with US encouragement. The US constantly is nudging them forward. And if you're looking at the modernization of force structures that are happening, the F-35 fighter jet, which is basically the most advanced fighter jet that the US has in its arsenal, you are seeing these upgrades taking place with America's encouragement. In Japan, in South Korea, and in Singapore, they're shifting from F-16s to F-35s, basically, which is very profitable for American corporations. So they, in a way, would like to see these tensions with China continue because it keeps the prices of US weapons very high and increases profit margins in question. So the US naturally is perturbed, it is nervous, but let me put it this way, there are all kinds of benefits that accrue to all kinds of actors to having a militarized or a security-oriented approach to the rise of China. My understanding is that it would be very, very difficult for any American president to reverse very deep, institutionalized, policy-level interaction, as opposed to political level interaction. Policy level linkages go back decades, certainly in the Northeast of Asia with South Korea and Japan. These are very, very tightly integrated countries, and they continue to be. Perhaps, I have no proof of this, but perhaps under the premise of a rising China, the US uses the rise of China as a reason to retain its presence in South Korea, Japan, and also now to re-engage, to relink, in a de facto sense at least, relink itself with Taiwan, I think.
Yeah, so, right. I take it that the military cooperation with Asian allies and the goal to rearm Japan already happened before the Trump presidency, is that right?
Yes, I would say that was already well in tow, and yes.
And
how much Trump?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. So do you think the Trump presidency has just simply continued what had already been institutionalized, or do you think anything changed at all?
There was certainly an attempt to reconfigure American engagement with the Asia-Pacific, Southeast Asia more generally, in the sense that America, basically under Trump, he viewed the United States as a mercenary force. And if you want us to come and protect you, if you want us to sell us weapons, well, you're going to have to pay for it. That was the basic idea. It wasn't premised on goodwill or cultural linkages or a deep history of political alliance. It was basically a transactional form of exchange as far as Trump was concerned. However, these alliances, as I said, were already so deep by the time Trump comes in 2017 that I don't see too much in the way of change. There was a lot of rhetoric. There were a lot of unpleasant exchanges in certain respects, given his, sort of erratic personality, perhaps. However, I think Moon in Korea and Abe in Japan handled him fairly well. They stroked his ego. They engaged him in very cordial and high-level, sumptuous summit exchanges of any number. I mean, I lost count the number of times Abe and Trump actually met over these last 4 years. And Abe has a history himself of dealing with very right-wing old men who don't have very open minds. If you look at Abe's own political history in the Liberal Democratic Party, he dealt with figures that were actually quite similar to Trump in his younger days. Therefore, I think he handled Trump very well, and he sustained the alliance. Never mind that I think the big problem now is not so much between South Korea and the US or Japan and the US. The problem is during the Trump years, the problem was between South Korea and Japan. These two countries have a very frosty relationship. And how does the US, if one thinks of it in a triangular fashion, the US being here, South Korea, Japan, what's basically happened is this. The US is still linked to both countries, but the relationship between the two big allies are very much frayed for all kinds of reasons that the US isn't really responsible for, I have to say. It has to do with history, culture, apologies for war crimes at that time, and certain South Korean politicians using that to increase their stock with South Korean voters. That's going to be a difficult thing. How much Trump contributed to that? Probably not very much. I think that's a bilateral issue that the new administration is going to have to try and mend some bridges here. But Trump was very rhetorical. He represented old economic interests in the US, largely premised on oil and coal. And he tried to increase the profile of traditional industries by exporting energy and weapons and things like this. So what the effect of this is long term, I would have to say it was very much mitigated by established policy linkages. He had an authoritarian streak, Trump, and he supported dictators like Rodrigo Duterte. But I must say, even if we didn't have a Trump, I don't know how critical the US would have been of Duterte. There might have been some rhetoric, but the reality behind that rhetoric would have seen more continuity than change. Even in a place like Thailand, say the Obama administration did a lot of damage perhaps to US-Thai relations by having a very frosty reaction to the 2014 coup. You know, it's still, the militaries of these two countries are still pretty tight. And it's improving, I think, because maybe Thailand doesn't want to be a colony of China and it wants to balance off Chinese power with an engagement with the far hegemon rather than exclusively being linked to a near hegemon. All of these things happened regardless of what Trump did or didn't say. There are big investments in East Asia and the Asia-Pacific. Universities, think tanks, all of these continue to operate. Seeing Trump as a potential problem, but one I think that was mitigated, that was limited in its impact because of policy level linkages.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer because it answered the question I was going to ask as a follow-up. I was going to ask, you know, because you were talking mainly about the American side of the relationship, right? So you said that the American approach didn't change much during the Trump presidency, but I was wondering about the other side of the relationship. So like the military government in Thailand, the authoritarian government of Duterte in the Philippines. So it seemed like there were a lot of moves by these governments signaling that they would try to distance themselves from the US. But yeah, I think you answered that question.
The pivot to China, yeah. Certainly. There are pivots to China among these national elites, or shall we say segments of these elites that I think in the case of Duterte, you're dealing with a very rare person. He comes from the periphery of the Philippine archipelago. He's not integrated into national elite politics and culture very well. In the case of Thailand, as I understand it, those officers that were not trained in the United States, that were actually trained in Thailand, have a more nationalistic view. They have been in the ascent in Thai military politics in recent years, and they've attempted to distance themselves from the United States, to pivot to China. But these regimes have to contend with established relationships, and I don't know how successful they have been at reversing them as such. What, of course, COVID has done, right, and this has injected a very unknown factor, and this is still part of the Trump era, after all, COVID. It occurred under his watch. It has tanked these economies. The Philippine economy and the Thai economy have been hit very hard, right? Indonesia still basically remains more pro-US in its national orientation. However, with with the tanking of these economies, with these very sharp contractions, and perhaps maybe the need for a functional vaccine, not a mystery vaccine, which is maybe not as effective as perhaps an American vaccine, they have tamped down, I think, on this anti-American sentiment. It occasionally surfaces, but with economic contraction, the room for maneuver has decreased in both of these countries. Of course, if you look at a place like Burma, which doesn't have very deep linkages with the United States, economic contraction has made the Burmese military more reliant on Chinese connections. Largely, I think, because of public relations and the Rohingya issue. The West cannot reach out its hand to Burma, and therefore they remain within the Chinese orbit. But I think Burma has always had a very deep relationship with the Chinese, uniquely so. Thailand being a more bending with the wind kind of country, it is more flexible in its historical orientations towards great powers. And the Philippines having a very deep relationship with the US, which, again, I think at policy level has persisted regardless of these pivot to China attempts. There can be, and I think Southeast Asians can learn much from the South Korean example. I think the South Koreans got this right. We can have very deep and profitable economic linkages with China, make a lot of money through Chinese trade, whilst at the same time sustaining security partnerships with the United States to guarantee that the near hegemon will not swallow the small powers, because we have a far hegemon that can guarantee our territory, our sovereignty, and our security. I think the South Korean example would serve all Southeast Asian nations rather well. Singapore certainly seems to be doing the same thing, if you want a nearer example. Yes, we do a lot of business with China. We trade with China. We buy American F-35s. We do joint exercises with the United States, because the United States, at the end of the day, is really going to be the only power that can keep China at bay. It's just plain geopolitical reality, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wish I could ask you more about, the details about the South Korean relationship. But for the interest of time, let me ask you the final question, which kind of looks into the near future. What can we expect in terms of geopolitical policies from the US by a Biden administration?
Yes. Indeed, Biden, I think, more than anything, will represent a return to the Obama administration, the Obama years, in terms of a pivot to Asia. So again, whilst there has been a pivot to China among Southeast Asian nations in certain respects, the pivot to Asia, or re-pivot to Asia perhaps, by the Biden administration will increase the negotiating power of Asia-Pacific nations with regard to China and the United States, certainly. You will also see, I think, a continuation of things that were happening under the Trump administration, weapons transfers, joint exercises, interoperability. The rhetoric will change. And again, what Biden really does represent, if you look at Democrats and Republicans in the United States, what they really represent are different sectors of the corporate elite. The Republicans in recent years have come to represent more traditional industries, oil, coal, these kinds of things, whereas the Democrats represent high technology corporations, IT corporations, and very, very advanced weapon system corporations. So these sorts of things. So you're going to have change. Yes, the rhetoric will change. The presentation will change. Certainly, Biden will be a better figure to go to state dinners in Seoul or Tokyo or Jakarta or Manila or wherever he may go as his presidency progresses, or Bangkok perhaps, who knows. But beneath the veneer of change, there are continuities. The one thing that might be scaled back are tariffs, anti-China tariffs, which created, I think, almost too much hostility. You cannot fight China. It's too big, it's too wealthy, and it's too globally engaged in order for there to be a war with the US and China, barring some unforeseen set of circumstances. However, you can say to neighboring countries, China is taking unilateral action to impose itself on your sovereignty, whether that be maritime or territorial. We can guarantee your maritime and territorial sovereignty if you choose to maintain security linkages with the United States. And I think that is to Southeast Asia's benefit. And the Biden administration might present that message more coherently and predictably, and hence encourage Southeast Asian nations and Asia-Pacific nations largely to engage with the United States on a more predictable basis.
One small follow-up question. So, what about the U.S. role in, domestic politics in Southeast Asia? A lot of people in Thailand, for example, are hoping that a Biden administration would do a little bit more in supporting democratization in Thailand, maybe putting a little bit more pressure on the military government. Do you think that's a wishful thinking?
That certainly is an option for the Biden administration. And Pawin Chachawal-Pongpan has also had this view that if the U.S. wants to remain relevant in Thailand, it must side with the forces of democracy in Thailand. However, if one looks at the history, the Democratic Party was massively supportive of the Thai military in the 1960s, massively supportive of the Thai monarchy. These are not liberal forces in Thai politics today. And one simply cannot say the history of US engagement with Thailand domestically has not encouraged democratization. It has encouraged very narrow political elites that are amenable to American geostrategic concerns. We don't want democracy. I mean, if you know, in the 1950s under Pibun Songkram, there was a brief experiment with parliamentary democracy from 1955 to 1957. How did the US react to that? It encouraged Sariq Tanarat to come in 1957, the most repressive military regime that Thailand has had probably until the NCPO regime of 2014 to 2019. So, and again, Democrats loved Sariq Tanarat in the 1960s, and Tanom and Prapas. These were not high-minded liberals. So I would be a bit cautious. However, that certainly is an option. If the Biden administration wants to pursue it, it's going to have pushback from the military. But again, if the protesters succeed in revising the Thai constitution, making the Thai monarchy more constitutional, and that's the name of the game in Thailand, the US wouldn't be necessarily averse to that. They might be amenable, particularly because Biden wants to project himself as a more benevolent representative of US interventions across the globe. That certainly might be the case. But if you look at the history, we tend not to support democracy in Thailand. Generally not. Prem, again, is a very good example of a strong man ruler that had marvelous relations with the United States in the 1980s, Prem Tinsulanon. So there is a history of very illiberal engagement.
Yeah, and that was a very late Cold War too. Some people think that the Cold War was like a unique time where the U.S. had to pursue geopolitical interest over all else. But then you have the U.S. relation with Prem. That kind of.
The notion that the U.S. is inherently predisposed to democracy is belied by looking at American foreign relations and the history of those foreign relations. During the Cold War, we didn't side with democracy, even in Japan, to say nothing of South Korea, which was a military dictatorship really until the 1990s, basically. Even in a more benign place like Japan, we sided with illiberal democracy, a kind of one-party, ultra-conservative, emperor-worshipping democracy. It wasn't the democracy of the Japan Socialist Party, certainly, or the Japanese Communist Party. Say nothing of that, right? Democracy is okay as long as it's okay for us. That's what American thinkers say in their honest moments. The rhetoric is one thing, the reality is another, sadly. But Yes, I mean, if there is a liberal form of change, the Thaksin government, for example, had a very good relationship with the United States. That was an electoral parliamentary government. So the US does have a tradition of this as well, and it can shift gears. The question then becomes, will the government, and again, this is all hypothetical, but if there is massive reform in Thailand, will the government that takes power be powerful enough to prevent a regression to military rule or right-wing rule? Because Thailand has this tradition as well. Very brief periods of democracy, followed by extremely harsh periods of military repression. 1950s, followed by Thanarat, 1973 to 1976, followed by the Tanin government, the most arch conservative and reactionary government Thailand has probably ever had. The Thaksin Shinawat, Yingluck, being followed by rather oppressive military governments. Can Thailand finally turn the corner and not regress after progressing? That's an open question.
Right. So, any last comments from you before we end this conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say again that when one is wedded to social media and Twitter and Facebook and this kind of constant stream of 24-hour news, one is bombarded with the constant sense that things are going to change immediately, irrevocably, and absolutely within the foreseeable future. But beneath the rhetoric, there are deep power structures that I think have weathered recent US political developments rather well, and one would ignore these hard power structures at their peril. You need to consider that these things still exist, and they're still going to have an impact, whether it's a Biden or a Trump or an NCPO or a elected government that pretends to be democratic but isn't, and so on and so forth. Deep structures, I think, matter more than discrete events, sadly.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Vartavarian, for your insight. Very interesting conversation. So, thank you so much.